So here we are back in the SD7T Quantum T session that we were using last week. And what we're going to do, we're going to run through a recap of some bits from last week, and then we're going to look at some more features. So as a quick recap, we talked about auto update. This was the fact that within your queue list, this auto update button should always be pressed. Really, there is, under normal circumstances, no need for you to unpress this and change to any manual updating. You know, the auto update rules will take care of it. Obviously, your scope needs to be set correctly with as much as you can in scope, so that is automatically writing data to the queues and recalling data to the queues, subject to the rules that we've set. And if you recall, if we look in the options panel, in our theatre options, the auto update exclusions, this is which data is automatically written to all queues, and that is the items here which are unchecked, and which data is written only to the queue that you are in. You know, as we said, it would make no sense if you made a mute change for that change to be rippled and written across the entire queue list. You only actually want that change to be made in the queue that you are in. So we looked at this auto update system. And the optional button, the way it changes its function between being able to write exceptions to the rule and write data for single queue parameter changes, or switching it back to its traditional channels and gangs function. So if you missed any of those bits, do go back and watch last week's video. In this one, we're going to extend the information a little bit. And continuing from our aliases conversation, which I will recap on now, we're going to look at players and data handling and how we program our control groups. So let's have a look at the aliases first. And if we go and look at our channel screen, if you recall, we had this channel set up here, and if I open up the setup panel and the aliases panel for my channel here, Dan, you can see we have two aliases, Dan and Dan in his hat. Currently here in Q6, we are in Dan in his hat. And we talked about how you can separate the use of the channel. So here, looking at the inheritance, Dan and Dan in his hat settings, the aliases, share data across much of the channel, but where the personal settings, filters, EQs and dynamics are different between Dan and Dan in his hat, they're isolated and won't update each other. So we've sort of separated the channel out, and now we can use the channel for multiple purposes, costume changes, or character changes across a bigger thing. And that's fine if you've got one person playing a role. But where do we get to if we are dealing with players? And this is where multiple people can play a certain role. And a role may well consist of lots of aliases. But we need a way of managing the settings that are personal to individual people playing those roles. And this is where our players system comes in. So if we go back to the master screen, and if I open up my players panel, you can see here that currently there are no players. If I scroll down here, there is nothing in place. But for my channel here, Dan in his hat, we want to introduce two people who are going to play this role of Dan. So up here on the top right corner, we can press new, and what we're going to get is a warning about checking our player scope. So if we just cancel that and come here at the minute, this single player update scope is how we determine what the differences are between different players. And this is a thing that once you set it and start working with this system and make some players, you can't change this scope. So it's worth thinking about and considering when you make a player, different players for different roles, what you ultimately want the differences to be. And again, like we did with aliases, much of this will be the same depending on, no matter who's playing the role. So auxes and routing and all of those sort of things, all the same, the sound design element of it are the same, regardless of who's playing a given role. But again, these personal settings, filters, EQs, dynamics, may well be different between players. So We're going to leave those three things set because they're the most common, sort of set of differences. And we're going to go ahead and make some players. So in here, the first player, and this will be person 1 playing Dan. And at this point, all we've done is tell the system that we're going to use the players function, and we've assigned a single person to play my role. And nothing within the channels or settings has changed. So if we look at the channels, here it tells us that the current person playing this channel, this role, is person 1, but nothing else has changed. We still have our same alias structures before, and everything is cool. If we go back to the master screen, and I now introduce a second player, person 2, we now have the ability to flip between people playing the role. And during rehearsals, this might be as you bring understudies or alternate actors on to rehearse a role, or it may be mid-performance when something goes wrong, someone falls ill, and you need to bring on somebody else. We can actually choose who is playing the role. And when we do this, it brings in all of their settings associated with it, those personal filters, EQ, dynamic settings that are associated with it. So if we leave it as player 1 at the moment, person 1 at the moment, and if we go to the top of the queue list and we look at our channels, as we fire down the queue list, everything will remain exactly as it was. There will be no differences. Everything is exactly as it was. Now, if we're in rehearsals and we would like to work with the other player, if we go to person 2, so looking at channel screens, if we are here in Q1 and we fire down, let's go to Q5, and here for Dan, we're going to make a change. Let's do some nice big obvious changes so we can see. So auto update will have written that to the Dan alias. So if we fire up to the top of the queue list, you'll see that that still is the same. If we get down to Q6, where Dan in his hat is, again, we can make a change here, and let's do something very obvious so you can see what we're doing. And this is Dan in his hat. And if you recall, when we get down to Q10, we have the same EQ for Dan in his hat. If we go back to our master screen and flip to player person 1, so the first player for this role, and we go back to the top of the queue list, when we look at our channels again, you'll see that what we have is person 1's settings. So again, fire down the queue list, and we have the person 1 settings. If I bring up person 2 playing the role and fire up and down the queue list, you can see we have person's 2 settings. So we have this separation of people playing roles and their settings which are associated with it. It's quite a powerful feature. You don't actually have to use it just for players. If you have depping musicians, different drummers that come in that have different kits or different instruments that sound different, again, you can use, this type of function to control channel settings sort of globally by populating the queue list with this simple selection. If we just look at the master screen and I close the queue list, we have the ability of creating sets of players. So again, this could be cast based. So if you had an A cast and a B cast, because you're dealing with younger people in the cast who can't do consecutive shows, or different band sets, different musicians, lots of ways of controlling how you record this data, either across multiple channels at the same time using the sets, or individually picking the players here. And you can copy data between players. and delete the data, and all sorts of manipulation here. But ultimately, this players will allow you at any point in the show to come in here, choose a different person to play a given role, and all you have to do is either fire the next cue or refire the same cue, and the show gets automatically updated with the correct data. So I hope that's clear. Players is an extension of aliases and managing data. Let's have a quick look at the channel cues panel, because obviously we've spoken a lot about data in this, and I've suggested that we have ways of managing it. So here in the layout menu, we have a channels queue. So I'm just going to bring that up for you to see. And this is a way of looking at the data for a show and looking at all the module data. So in this little pop-up here that says choose channels, we're just going to look at the Dan channel, close this panel. And in this condensed form, channel 2, which is what we had on the surface, you can see the structure of the show, which is Dan and the aliases, Q6, Dan in his hat, back to Dan, and then Dan in his hat again. And you'll notice they're either black here in bold, or they're greyed out. And the grey indicates that there is no change from the previous cue. So I can look down this, and without actually firing any data, firing the show, I can be sure that for this channel, after Q1, no settings change, a program to be different, until we get to Q6, where the alias changes to Dan in his hat, and then it comes back to Dan. We can actually use this panel to assign in aliases. So here in Q3, if we opened up the assign panel, I can choose all the aliases associated with this channel, and I could choose Dan in his hat. And you can see it's populated it, so we've got 2 cues of Dan, Dan in his hat, Dan, Dan, Dan in his hat. And we can see that. So that's one way of programming aliases. Of course, you could also do it if we go and look at our channel screens. It will be exactly the same as doing it here and picking which alias we're going to use. But if we come back to here for a moment, this is the closed up view. If I were to expand it out using this black arrow at the top, what it shows me is the individual module data for this channel. So again, the grey up in these columns here indicates that nothing changes as you fire down the show. But if you recall, when we set the alias up originally last week, it was the filters, the EQs and the dynamics that are different between Dan and Dan in his hat. So here, when we get to Q3, we can see that the filters, the EQ, the dynamics change. And actually the number after it here, the 6, indicates that we were in Q6 when we originally made this alias. So it gives us a bit more sort of data mining as to where the data comes from. And we can see the changes. There's a lot of information here. So up the top right hand corner, if we switch this to show stars only, the star indicates a change. We're not necessarily worried about what the change is, but the star indicates where there is a change. And if you imagine you've got 200 cues and you're scrolling up and down data looking like this, sometimes it can be quite difficult to spot what you need to do. So the stars view just shows you changes to data. If I come in and reassign this Dan alias in this left-hand column here, you can see going across horizontally that data gets reassigned and it pulls in the names. If I come in here and show you some differences, if I pull up a channel where we haven't done nothing yet, channel 13, I'll just close this up. Channel 13 has generic channel 13 data within it. It doesn't have any specific names. If I were to rename channel 13 now, this closed up view, this column here where it says channel 13, would update to show me the new channel name. But the underlying data, all of these other cells that show me just channel 13 EQ and dynamics and insert modules, they would remain with their generic channel 13 data. So it goes back to the thing I said very early last week video, that naming stuff before you make your cues is super important. So if you name your channels when you start creating cues, all of this module data within this spreadsheet is correctly named so that, you know, years down the line when the show is still running, you still can, you know, look at the data and understand where it came from and all those sort of things. Let's just take channel 13 out. There's a few. You'll notice actually I try and work with very few channels here. If you have everything switched on in here, and this shows you all your channels, and you can look at input channels, output channels, whatever, it's a lot of scrolling and a lot of data to deal with. So by default it shows you nothing, and the best thing I find to do is to come in and just look at the channels that you're going to look at. So in this expanded view we can see this. Now if we've made programming mistakes, we want to make specific changes, we can use this panel. I would say this is not a programming tool, it's there's been a problem, something wasn't quite what I expected, or, you know, someone's changed their mind, I need to fix it tool, rather than a specific, in a certain queue I need to make a certain change. But for argument's sake, let's take Q6, and we need to remove this Dan in his hat EQ for whatever reason. I can come in here and look at all of the different EQs for this channel. We've got our Dan in our hat EQ made in Q6, or we've got our original one. And when I select it, you can see that just the EQ module changes, falls back into line with the rest of it. Auto update will continue to work. You know, all of the normal parameters and functions will continue to work, but it's been pulled back in line with the rest of the channel. So now the only place in this channel where it has a different EQ is Q10, when the original Dan in his hat. Of course, you know, I can put that back and make it so. There was one other sort of useful part of this channel. I think it was let's have a quick look. Let's just have a look at some other channels in here and close them up. You'll see here for channel 5, it changes complete alias from Vicky to Helen in Q10. So if we expand that out, you remember when we made the alias, we selected every module to be new and unique for Helen as a new character. So completely across the board, it has new modules for everything. The other thing you'll see in here is this purple one for the aux send in Q5. And again, going back to last week, this was when we used the optional to make an exception. And this is writing with the optional button pressed, and you get the green warning on screen, writing a parameter change for one parameter in one queue that is a one-off event. And it flags it with this don't inherit any changes from other queues. It isolates it and becomes a unique one-off setting. And in this panel, it shows us this as this purple one, and at the top left-hand corner here, it gives you a little key that some controls will inherit changes. And if we look at the details for it, we can see that it was aux1 level and the on-off switch, which are flagged here with the inherit flag as don't update their changes. So again, that was a one-off programming change. They're the sort of things that in reality, someone might change their mind and you need to reset, in which case, having this cell selected, opening up the assign panel and picking the original, which is this middle one here, the original aux setting for it, brings it back into line, and now that optional inherit flag has been removed and the aux is all track and run correctly for auto update. You'll see it's disappeared off the list here now because actually it's not used anywhere in the session now, that data. We can still get it back, so if we come to all channels, instead of this channel settings, we can look at the unused data, and here it is for the aux settings, that Vicky aux send for the change you made using optional. So, you know, until you've been in and deleted, if we go back to the master screen, and if you recall in the options theatre, there was this delete all unused. Until you've done that, all of that data is still accessible in the all channels unused. So once we reassign those back, let's do it again, reassign, it falls back into line. These are all grey, indicating there's no change. Look at all channels, unused data, and we can recover data that we've removed. Okay. So I realise there's lots in here. It's quite a big, complicated panel. But actually, you know, as you're running the show or doing your tech rehearsals and you come to a point, you go, that wasn't quite right. You know, I want to go back and have a look at it. You know, with an offline piece of software networked to your console, or, you know, just looking at it on your laptop or on the console without firing any cues, you can come into this panel, choose the channel, you know, find out where that data is wrong and potentially either make a note to go back and fix it later, or using the assign panel, come in here and reassign the correct data in. There's a few other little buttons down here. We've been operating in update single mode, which writes data just to single queues. You can write data across the entire queue list, excluding groups. The ripple down function, as you'll see in the CG queues programming, writes data and it ripples down the show until it sees a change of state. And we'll explain it more in the CG queues panel, but it's a way of rippling data down the show, not overwriting any programming that you've made, but populating elements of the show. An update all will update all instances of an alias. So if I come into the filters one, update all is not going to update all queues, but if I take Dan Hat and say all of Dan Hats for the filters need to become Dan, it leaves the other columns alone and just replaces all the Dan Hat filters with Dan filters. So it's worth, before you make any assignments, just coming down here to the bottom right hand corner and checking the scope of how you're going to write this data in. So that's channel queues. The last piece of the puzzle, really, from a programming point of view, that I'm going to cover in this is the control group queues. And again, this is very different to how we program VCA's control groups in our live software. And so it's worth, you know, this is a really big part of theatre programming for a DiGiCo theatre console. So let's have a look at that. So I've got, find the right panel here. I've got my control group queues panel, and this is what opens up when you press the control group queues panel. And it's like a big spreadsheet. By default, it has our default channel CG names in. There's no sort of assignments and data associated with it, but it's got our default names. And here, this is a keyboard operation. We're going to use our left and our right click on our mouse to make assignments and to paste data in. So the first thing I'm going to do is clear these data out. I've got my ripple down, bottom right hand corner, my ripple down function switched on. And I'm going to right click in these cells. If I take ripple down off, if I right click in a cell, it will just clear the individual assignments. And again, we've got some color coding here, black being a change, green being the same as the one before. So you can see here how those colors get updated. If I put ripple down back on and take CG7 here and clear it from the top, it'll clear it down all the way to Q4, and it will stop when it gets to Q5 because there's already, in this cell, there's already a change. Something different happens. So clear it down, and again, I can work my way down and clear it. But I would generally probably start with just, you know, go along and right click and clear these out, so you've got a sort of a blank spreadsheet to work with. And really, the idea here is we're going to map out our VCA faders, our control group faders, from the top of the show down. And if we do it from the top down, obviously working with a script, and we've done some planning for this, using the ripple function and the clear, it's very quick for us to assign in and build these CG assignments. So a combination of this panel and our assign to control group little floating panel that's got our channels in it. And if we just look at that panel for the moment, across the top section are our predefined sets. Again, remember last week we made these predefined sets of channels, which serve two purposes. They serve the purpose of set spill, bringing stuff to the surface. If you don't know what set spill is, tomorrow Tom has a video on that he's doing at 6 o'clock on Facebook. But also from a theatre perspective, it gives us a programming tool to very quickly put channels into control groups. The bottom half of the assignment panel shows us our channels ourselves, and it's split up as it would be on the surface. So we have left and right banks and layers, and we can filter by inputs only, or we can look at all the channel types. Remember, a control group can have inputs, outputs, you know, whatever you like in it. But primarily we're concentrating on our inputs. You'll also see down here, we've got our channel names: Bob, Dan, Andy, Nick, Vicky, Joanne, Sharon, etc. But underneath we've got our aliases listed. So this actually provides us a shortcut for two parts of programming. We're going to program our control groups and put channels into control groups, but we're also going to assign our alias at the same time. So it actually, from a workflow and a speed point of view, makes it much quicker. So let's start with control group 1, and we'll assign Bob in, and you can see using the ripple function it's assigned Bob for the entire duration of the show. Let's say Bob stays on for the first two cues. If we right click in Q3, he disappears. In Q2 he's joined by Dan, so let's put Dan in. And Dan is in for 2 cues, and we right click in Q4 and he disappears. So we can very quickly add people to this, and they can come into the show and they can stay for various parts, and we can very quickly build up this map. We don't have to update the cues, we don't have to, you know, write this and store it, auto update. We'll take care of it, and when you fire the cue, this is the assignment you'll see. If we want to bring our aliases into it, let's go to Q5 and Dan. We pick Dan and his hat. So now Dan and his hat will be assigned, you know, in terms of channel settings and control group all at the same time. And then he comes back and he takes his hat off, and he's joined by, you know, other people on stage. It's a very quick visual way of laying out and programming your VCAs. If we're going to do it, let's say we've got something for our band, we could come in here and pick drums, and it's pulled in using the sets that we've built. It's pre-selected. If you look at the bottom here, it's pre-selected the channels that were part of that group. Obviously, I've made up some sets here, but you can see the principle. We can also, instead of pre-selecting sets here, we can build custom groups. So if I take ripple off, and we'll just come down to Q7, Q3 control group 7, and using this panel at the bottom, I'm going to pick some channels and hold my shift key like I would if I was editing an Excel spreadsheet, and it allows me to pick a bunch of channels. You'll notice the text here for channel 14 here is blue, because that indicates that I've built a scratch group. It's something that I've just made up on the fly. I could rename it, and let's call that scratch, just so we know what it is. If I then decide I would like to use that again at some other later date, I can hit the create new set button, and it builds a set. So if we look in the sets panel here, we have now a set called scratch, which has those channels selected in it. So at any point in the show later, if I wanted to use those channels again, I have them available to me. So this, you know, really is worth spending some time, you know, getting to grips with it and understanding it. But the combination of left click, right click, and the ripple down allows you to very quickly build these sets. The final part of this one is down in the bottom left-hand corner, where we've got an all settings or CG membership switch. And primarily I will always start this in all settings. And that is that I'm going to be recalling aliases, essentially, all of the channel settings when I bring in one of these assignments. But if you've done a load of programming and actually all you want to do, you don't want to affect channel settings or alias selection or anything like that, all you want to do is bring in a different VCA assignment, a different control group assignment. If we come down here and choose CG membership only, it will only affect CG membership rather than bringing aliases back when you make an assignment. But primarily, if you've got your workflow right and you're doing, you've built your aliases and you understand it and you haven't got exceptions everywhere and you sort of run auto update in the way intended, for 99.9% of the time, you can run this in all settings mode. And when you build your CG, it brings the right alias to the channel and makes the CG assignment all in one go. The other thing this does is when you add channels here, it will also do your mute programming. So the auto mute function of our control groups means that when a channel is added to a control group, the channel is automatically unmuted, and when a channel is removed from a control group, the channel is automatically remuted. So mute programming on a sort of an individual channel level, for the most part, is taken care of by this sort of process. A channel is only unmuted when it is under control group control. It's only been assigned to a control group, which means you can't have open channels that aren't, under your physical control of a VCA. So that I think that really covers control group assignment. There are a few other bits that I wanted to talk about this week. We had some questions that were posted as part of last week's video. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of those to give answers to those that were kind enough to pose these questions. Sorry I didn't get to answer them last week, so here we go. Let's open up the queue list. So Dan asked about recall times and transport control and MIDI timecode and all those sort of functions. So most of the consoles, all the consoles have a MIDI input that will read MTC. Quantum 7 has an LTC input as well. In the setup panel in external control, no, in the setup panel in timecode and transport, you can set the timecode source to be incoming MIDI, and it will tell you the frame rate it's receiving and all those sort of things. So make sure you've got MIDI selected in here. When we expand out this scope and look at recall times, we have two columns of data that we potentially want to work with. The duration one, and let's just put something here for Q5. The duration panel allows us to set a length of time the cue will last for when it is fired. So if I fire Q5 now, we have a 5-second timer, and then it would automatically carry on. If I just do that again, there is this duration active button here, which allows you to, once you've fired a cue that has a duration time, allows you to stop it carrying. But if I switch that back on, it will start the timer, the 5 seconds, and that allows us to program individual lengths of time for each cue to last. The recall at column is the MTC value, the incoming code value that the cue will be fired at. So if you have a show that is programmed to code, so you're feeding the console code, this is not just for theatre, it happens in other sort of circumstances as well, but it allows us to put in down here a value at which the cue will be fired. And when, let's put something in here so you can see it, and when that value is reached, let's put it in the right column, that cue will be fired. If you're firing code at the desk, you can hit the capture recall times and it will capture the incoming code value. There is in the layout menu this transport control. If I come to this screen, you can see we have a panel that has transport control, and this will display incoming MIDI as well. If you're running MMC and want to run integration with other systems, you can fire transport controls as well. But for the most part, we see in theatre that it's actually probably going to be incoming code values and incoming code that you want to program your queues against. So, so that was the recall times, recall at column. Of course, you can, once you've set a time, you can turn it on and off, and then you've got your duration one as well. So your follow-ons, auto follow-on queues. So thank you, Dan. That was your question. Ken had a couple of questions, one of them about offline software and screen resolutions. Most of the SD software is 1024-768. But if you are Quantum 338, our newest console, which is higher resolution screens, ideally you want to be at 1280, 1024. I mean, most modern computers are going to have a higher resolution than that. So we're not enforcing any big, HD resolutions or anything crazy. 1024-768 for most of the SD stuff, and 1280-1024 for Quantum 338. Ken also asked about transferring aliases between consoles. Aliases are not transferable as an alias exactly, but if we look at our channels and we think about what it is, an alias is really just a set of channel settings. So the best way of transferring aliases between consoles is to use the presets function, and this will allow us to make presets of channel settings. So this is Dan and his hat, so let's call that Dan and his hat settings. If we were to recall Dan, we could make a Dan preset, so we have the channel settings stored. At that point on our master screen, we could load and save our presets, and when we move that, all of our channel settings come in between. When we go to a new desk and we want to bring those things in, we load our presets file, go to a channel, go to an alias, and recall the preset. Now, it doesn't matter how you get those channel settings into the channel, whether you manually dial them in or whether you load a preset, the act of placing them in the channel by recording the preset, auto update takes that, populates the show, and essentially you've transferred alias settings, and alias is just channel settings. So using presets to move your data between different shows is the best way. And of course then some of the differences between maybe a 10T and a 7T or a Quantum T, those differences sort of go away because channel settings are a little bit more universal than that. So that's the way I would deal with transferring aliases. And Alex asked us a question about recommended format for USB sticks. FAT32 is what we would say you need to use. That's backwardly compatible with FAT16 if you've got old stuff, but FAT32 PC format is what you should be doing your USB sticks to. And again, if you're going to send files and transfer stuff onto USB sticks, zip them up before you send them. It stops them getting chewed up or ruined by the internet. Don't put any sticks into your console that run auto run exe files or anything. You don't really want anything like that. You want to make sure any USB sticks are formatted, clean, and ideally virus free. Shouldn't be talking about viruses at this point, but yeah, virus free, no auto run files, no other exes, FAT32, and please, if you're going to do stuff, zip up your session files before you email them.